Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and welcome back to Season 2 of Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts, David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy vs. Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, Canada's new climate plan is big and bold, but will it deliver on our climate goals? Will it lead to a healthy economy, as its title suggests, or will it crush it? What does a $170 per ton carbon price by 2030 mean for Canadian industry? And is it politically stable, or might it be overturned with the next election? To help us answer those questions, we're joined by guest Mark Jaccard. Mark is an energy economist and a distinguished professor at Simon Fraser University. As one of Canada's foremost climate and energy thinkers and actors, he has served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and on the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. Mark opened the webinar by walking us through the climate plan's essentials. He included modeling results that show a small annual GDP growth hit to Canada's economy as we try to lower our emissions from 700 megatons to 500 megatons. As part of this, he walked us through the necessary actions in sectors in order to reduce emissions so that we actually achieve that target. That sparked considerable discussion and debate, as you'll soon find out. Now on to the show. Hello, and welcome everyone to our 11th Energy versus Climate webinar, and the first of Season 2. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my usual webinar co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith from here in Alberta. And it's good to be back. Now, exactly 2 months ago on December 4th, we recorded our last webinar of 2020. And 1 week after that, on Friday, December 11th, the federal government released its new climate plan, which was optimistically called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. It notably featured the eye-grabbing $170 per ton carbon price by 2030. So it's been like a Christmas gift sitting under the tree for an excruciating 2 months for us. And hopefully for those of you, fellow climate and energy geeks, we've not been able to talk about it. But finally today, we can unwrap that Christmas present. And so it's like Christmas has finally arrived in early February. And it clearly is a hot topic. Today we had 718 registrants, which we think is fully half of all Canadians who are aware of the fact that Canada has a new climate plan. So to help us with the unpacking, we have enlisted the help of one of Canada's foremost climate and energy thinkers and actors. And I speak, of course, of the esteemed Mark Jaccard. I first learned of Mark early in my career at the Pembina Institute when I bought a copy of his 2006 book, Sustainable Fossil Fuels, which won the Donner Prize for the top policy book in Canada that year. And Mark and his work at Simon Fraser University ever since has been a constant presence, whether I've been copied on furious debates he's had with, say, Pembina's climate director about offsets and additionality, or I've turning to his modeling in our work, or even referencing and citing his work in my testimony to parliamentary committees. Mark has been there. I don't think he needs much of an intro for this audience. He's been a prof at Simon Fraser University since 1986, except for a 5-year sabbatical when he headed up British Columbia's Utilities Commission. He has served on the IPCC, domestically on the good old National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. He's a fellow at the Royal Society of Canada and C.D. Howe Institute, and currently he directs the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU. And David's going to give a shout out for his latest book in a little bit. So the format for today's show. So Mark is going to open with a brief introduction to the new climate plan. And we have a treat for everyone because he's going to present a slide with hot off the presses, new modeling by the good folks at Navius around that carbon price. We'll have a discussion till 12:35, and then we will take your questions. Just one note, today we're framing our conversation around 2030, not 2050. We will save the whole net zero discussion for a later episode in season 2. Without any further ado, Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Ed, and hi everyone, and hi to my co-panelists. This program that you guys have been doing is getting a lot of interest, and my own grad students all watch it, and I really appreciate the opportunity myself to appear on it. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. I want to be really quick because I know the key part of this, of what you do here, is the back and forth conversation, which I highly value. So I've got just 3 slides, and I've actually got someone else who's putting them up for me. And so maybe I can ask her to screen share now. And the first slide is just shameless self-promotion. It's letting you know about my latest book, and I'll probably be able to sneak in some comments about that as the discussion goes on.
I'll plug it in a minute. I think you'll be happy with my plug, Mark.
Okay, all right. And Twitter handles and websites and so on. So can we go to the next slide? So there's 2 substance slides. I just wanted to make sure that everybody on this program had a somewhat same level or starting point for what the new plan is. It's we have a carbon price federally. We'll see if the Supreme Court sustains that. It's called a backstop carbon price because they're willing to allow individual provinces to have their own carbon price if they're in the same ballpark. So the backstop federal price will now rise annually by $15 after 2022, when it's supposed to hit 50 and will reach 170. And that's gotten a lot of the press, of course, because carbon pricing is such a volatile issue, but there are other elements in there that are quite important. For large emitting industry, there's something, you see an acronym there, OBPS, that means output-based pricing system, where you do get that same $170 price signal to industry, but you make sure that their average cost of carbon is much lower because of worries about competitiveness. They have to compete with industry from countries that are not as aggressive as Canada would be. And so you want to be able to move ahead and yet not shoot yourself in the foot. So when people blame the carbon price and say it's wiping out our economy, you need to question that and see what the details are. We're going to tighten regulations, the phase out of coal-fired power plants, methane regulations that were slowed and soon to develop. In transportation industry, energy, we have a clean fuel standard. It's going to zero in on liquid fuels. And then there's subsidies for various things, retrofits, electric vehicles, industrial innovation, electric vehicle recharging as well. Support for infrastructure like transit and land use carbon management, and the possible development of carbon tariffs. So there are elements of the plan that are still not specified. They're going to be worked out over the coming years. Now, it's early game to actually simulate the plan, and so, but a lot of us are getting to it. The group that Ed mentioned, Navius, is a group of modelers in downtown Vancouver. Many of the people on that team are former students of mine. We have a relationship, but we actually use different models. They've simulated this, and so I'm just going to, they believe that under most of their scenarios, this plan, the $170, if they come through with the other elements, it would get us close to that Paris target. I just used rough numbers there, 700 down to 500 to help people remember roughly what we're talking about. It is designed to minimize industrial competitiveness. There will be a slight hit to GDP growth. In other words, if our annual GDP growth, if we had kept the price at $50 all the way through to 2030, maybe our average annual GDP growth would have been 2.1%. This brings it down to 1.9%. But of course, all of these costs depend on what other countries do as well, because that'll determine, for example, the oil market and therefore the demand for Canada's oil and the oil price. And it also, the price of electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. Can we go to the last slide? And here, now be gentle. But Navius just quickly simulated this, which is pretty good considering that was the Christmas period when they did it. And I asked them to send some of it and what they've done, and they were a little nervous. And I just wanted to give you a crude sense of what some people might come up with, but there can be very different mixes. So I ask you not to look at the 2-year increments between sort of 2020 and 2030, but just to look at 2030 and look at the relative size of those columns, and they just give you a bit of a sense of what might be going on. And again, you can change some assumptions and get different outcomes here. I want to say that this particular simulation assumed a low oil price, so not much expansion of oil sands, a low carbon capture and storage price, which made it cheaper to do carbon capture and storage, and no DAC, direct air capture, whereas a lot of people are thinking we want to make that happen in the year 2030 timeframe. I certainly want us to, and maybe David Keith does as well. And so anyway, I just take a look at those. The very top one shows that, left to right, output is at the top of the column, and it's saying that we're going to increase some things like road freight emissions and even some industrial output. And so not only do you have to reduce your emissions from 700, there are things that would have pushed them up over that decade. So that's what that's showing. It's above the zero line. And then the next thing is energy efficiency. That's obvious. The next, electricity, and so this is renewables, and I think that's mostly going to be in electricity generation and transport. I haven't looked in great detail. The orange is other industrial emissions. Some of that will be process emissions when you're making cement, aluminum, and so on. But I'm not sure of all the details in there right now. The line after that is natural gas, which is mostly replacing coal and so on. And then carbon capture and storage is looking pretty large there, like almost like 50 megatons. So maybe that's not viable, maybe it is. And then the last part, electrification, of course, in vehicles, industry, for light temperature needs, and buildings. And so I'm going to stop there. That was just to give you a quick get-go with what the plan is and how it might entail achieving the 2030 target. Thanks for your attention. Over to you, David.
Thanks. Great summary. I guess I want to start by saying, this will sound a little sappy, but I'm really kind of proud to be a Canadian. Having a carbon policy like this is a big effing deal compared to what's happened elsewhere in the world. And carbon policy, as we discussed before on the show, is particularly tough in Canada. Lots of Canadians like to think they're green, and maybe they are by some measures. This kind of shows that. But the reality that we were highly resource dependent, we're a major oil and other heavy upstream industry producer, and that we have a relatively weak federal government compared to the provinces, makes it, I think, inherently very hard to do climate policy for real in Canada. And if you'd asked me whether I thought we would have a climate policy this strong, I would have bet against it. So I am really thrilled and proud that this happened. It's a big deal by any measure. And I think it says something important about the way the world may be shifting towards more aggressive climate policies. I do want to, as I said, plug Mark's book a little bit. The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success really is a remarkable and unusual book that I highly recommend as a kind of practical guide to the way climate looks. And indeed, to plug that, another book that will come out in 2 weeks, Bill Gates's book. This is an advanced copy because I was involved a little bit. This comes out in 2 weeks. It's terrific. And I think you could hardly do better, actually, than Mark and Bill's book as kind of backgrounds to how to think big picture about this problem and in a realistic way. Now to say, we're going to get into some of the complexities, but while the $170 a ton is a BFD, there's lots of complexity under the hood. And I personally think the chance of actually getting emissions cuts that big by 2030 is pretty low. When I think about the actual timeline to roll out technologies in the real world with the way governments actually work. So for example, the idea in that model, not to critique the model, but just sort of realistically, the idea to get 40 or so megatons a year of CCS by 2025, that requires final investment decisions on the plants, maybe already to happen or to happen basically now, given the actual development timelines. And that's true both the scale of big plants, but I think it's also the scale of house energy efficiency. I'm in the middle of building a house and trying to figure out how to make it geothermal. And these things are inherently very slow, 2-year timelines for each individual decision, some 8 years. So I think that the policy is terrific, but the reality is it'll be tougher than people think and tougher than equilibrium models like that suggest to actually get emissions cuts that big.
Great. Let's hear from Sarah. So Sarah, David is proud as a Canadian. You're also a Canadian, like David, a dual citizen. It's a BFD, which is an acronym. I didn't know what it meant until just a couple of days ago. So thank you, David, for expanding my vocabulary. Sarah, what do you think?
So I am also proud to be a Canadian, and proud about the climate plan. I think I'm, with my dual citizenship, as you said, Ed, I'm also now proud to be an American with the climate plan that is rolling out there as well. And I actually think that that's part of how to view what is going on, and is this a big deal or is it not? On the one hand, I think it is, and it's one of the things around the carbon price, going to 170, that is a big deal to me, is that that's really a step change, I think. So I think about the response to carbon pricing that firms have a little bit like, and I'll bring in a physics analogy, a little bit like the photoelectric effect here. So people can Google that and learn more about that. But the idea is that below a certain level of pricing or energy that you're injecting, you may get a little bit of movement from that, but you need to reach some critical point or critical mass where the price gets high enough that people just kind of start to care. And so I think that, it can be tempting to say, well, we had a carbon price before and this is going up, so therefore it's, that percentage of a bigger deal. But I think it's more than that because of that step change. At the same time, though, I think that there is a little bit of a fair question of how much is this Canada leading and how much is it politicians rushing to get out and in front of the parade, and that's part of what policymakers do. So that's not a criticism necessarily of what's going on, but I think that there has been a change in the way that the world is kind of going, also on the technology and on the business side as well too. Certainly also with the American government moving forward very quickly on some of these things as well. So I think it's a both a big deal and it's a little bit of getting out ahead of that parade that's happening. And I think we'll come back to this more, but on that technology timelines, I agree with David. I think around some of the things like carbon capture and storage. I do think, though, that on some of the other technologies, things like renewables and electric vehicles, we have spent the past 20 years doing a lot of that, pre-work. And so those are really ready for prime time and ready to ramp up quite quickly. And so, I think that there's, 2030 is an interesting time because it's, are we going to, how far into electrification of vehicles will we get? We'll see. But I think we have a lot that's ready to go and ready for that prime time already.
Great. Yeah. So I myself, I wasn't surprised with the triple digit announcement. Like, we've known that we've needed triple digit carbon prices, frankly, for decades. I remember when I was at the Penman Institute, we released a report called Climate Leadership, Economic Prosperity. It called for a triple digit carbon price, $100, $150. We had at the time, immediate response. We had Ed Stelmach, then Premier of Alberta, responding within an hour of its release, saying, "We're crazy. How could you?" And but we knew. And Mark, you were doing modeling back then, saying this is what we needed to do. So no surprise. But frankly, I was at first surprised by the timing. There were all sorts of reasons because of COVID disruption that they could have said now is not the time. We need to get back to recovery. We're going to punt this one. COVID has changed the rules for everything. But then they went ahead and did it. And I think, to your point, Sarah, when I said, well, why did they do it? And it caught a lot of people by surprise. I think the Biden administration and not wanting to get caught too far behind was a really big impetus. But we talk a lot about the price, and we'll talk more about the economic implications. But with that plan, let's recognize that it also included another very important component, and that's a clean fuel standard. And we've gotten, after that plan, we got some more details. But the big thing in that announcement was they still said we're going to go ahead with this clean fuel standard, a Canadian equivalent of like California's low carbon fuel standard, or BC's, but we're going to ditch applying it to gaseous and solid fuels. And in doing so, in fact, they gave a big break to natural gas producers, and I would say a big concession to Alberta. By implication, because by giving it up, they left 8 megatons left that the CFS was supposed to cover. They said, we're going to cover that through the carbon price. So my understanding is typically a regulatory instrument like that would be more effective than trying to get at it with the carbon price. Their math is those 8 megatons, we just jacked the price to 170. we're going to cover it. Mark, you had told us you were involved and you're providing advice to the feds all the time. Tell us about the clean fuel standard and tell us sort of maybe your rationale behind giving up that portion that was to be covered by the CFS.
Sure. Thanks, Ed. Well, I want to correct. I'm giving them advice all the time, but I don't know if they listen. You're probably giving them advice all the time.
Yeah, and they also don't listen.
Yeah, and just before the CFS, though, I too wanted to comment on that $170 price, and I was interested in what Sarah said because I am all these years, I'm always worried about climate sincere politicians, which I describe in the book, as being eliminated. What are the, because most likely humans are going to fail. We're not 30 years have proven that. What are the small strategic path by which we might succeed? So I've been saying to governments, use a regulation. Only if you really feel you can win with a price. And so I see this price, like, because they knew it would get all the press. And I'm calling it the 905 gamble. It's because the polling, you're going to form a government in Canada if you win the 905. And so I would say to them, so you're polling in the 905 and you might win with this? And it seems to be getting more like this. And that seems to be kind of reflecting what Sarah was getting at, some kind of shift there, but it could be wishful thinking bias. So I'll leave that, but I find that really interesting. In terms of what I've worked on a lot, which is to say, if you are a climate sincere politician and you think you'd be committing 905 suicide with a carbon price like Stéphane Dion, then there are other policies that are almost as efficient or effective. And so the clean fuel standard was something where they actually tried to say, we're going to have a regulation to sort of decarbonize. So, mix hydrogen in with natural gas or biomethane in with natural gas, supplant coal with wood or other things. And in vehicles, not only go to biofuels like ethanol and biodiesel, but also count electricity and hydrogen as fuels under a policy. So that's what happens in the low carbon fuel standard in California and British Columbia. And it looks now that the federal government has said, okay, we're throwing in the towel for now on the gaseous component, as Ed said, and the solid component of coal, because we've got other policies working on those. And we're going to try to focus more in on transportation. So basically that the clean fuel standard, it looks like they're intending to make it a lot more like British Columbia's low carbon fuel standard or California. So you can look these things up. And what they can do with that, and I have to support doing this, is you then focus that policy. And I think we can move faster in light duty vehicles, again, as Sarah was mentioning. And you just have to look at Norway and now Sweden and Denmark following them, and Finland, and perhaps the rest of Europe, to say that what you can do with that regulation is it says the carbon intensity has to go down. If I'm selling gasoline and I don't have a way of lowering carbon intensity, I have to subsidize somebody who's selling electricity from clean sources or hydrogen from clean sources. And that's a way of incentivizing, like a carbon price, to reduce emissions in transportation. And I think it's a good idea. And we already have a model out there anyway. So that's what I'm hoping for.
I guess I have to jump in. I shared an office with Alex Farrell, who sadly passed away, who was one of the key architects of the low carbon fuel standard and stood beside Schwarzenegger when it was signed. And I think there's a certain level of each time it gets replicated, people add more complexity. So the core of LCFS, of course, didn't allow you to pay for, the idea you just like pay for some technology development or pay for electric charging stations. It was really ruthlessly and simply focused on the socially important thing, allowing capitalism to thrive by competing on the well-to-wheels carbon intensity at the drive shaft. And Canada, in trying to build that in, added a whole bunch of stuff that I think will be gameable. So I salute them trying to do an LCFS-like thing, but I think there's a lot of stuff in there that feels very different from the core of LCFS. Yeah,
and let's not forget that a bunch of California's LCFS reserve credits literally went up in smoke in the California fires last fall. Okay, I do want to move us on. Can we launch the first poll? So let's get to this question that Mark had. I love the expression, the 905 gamble. So let's talk about how politically stable we think this carbon price is going to be. And
for economists, I can pose the question, we're talking at the shadow price here. We're talking about basically counting both regulations and prices. What is the effective average shadow price, the price that people really feel in 2030?
Yes, thank you, David, to put it into econo speak. But I do want to note before I pass it back to my colleagues here, Mark mentioned there's a Supreme Court hearing in March on the federal government's right to impose a carbon tax on provinces. So obviously that is a huge factor. And then what has been lost is that Jonathan Wilkinson, Environment and Climate Change Minister, when talking about it, has been saying that price increases post-2022 are subject to conversations with the provinces. So we could almost look at it as aspirational at this point. And we remember in December 2016, around the Pan-Canadian framework, Christy Clark, who was then BC's premier, her famous intervention, who said, I'll only sign if we put in review dates around the carbon price and we give some power back to the provinces. Okay, so I've lost track. Who wants to jump in here? Maybe Sarah, why don't you talk about political stability of the price?
Okay, so I'll come back to my, getting out in front of the parade. And the more that is what's happening, the more politically stable, of course, things become. There's two specific groups and kind of lenses through which I would look at this. So one is, the electorate, so, the 905 and more generally. And then the second is the kind of what other coalitions of support among companies and industry there is for carbon pricing. And so on the first, we do have polling, right, that's continuously coming out that shows that Canadians do, with an overwhelming majority, want there to be action on climate. And so, how, I'm not a political scientist, so how that translates into voting behavior, I guess is open for a question. But I think if you believe what Canadians are saying when they answer those polls, it's very clear that, they want to see this happen going forward. But perhaps even more importantly, I think we are starting to see a change in that calculus of the coalitions of support and the way that companies are really looking at a price on carbon. And so what I mean by that is, ultimately, if you have a bunch of people that are benefiting from that price on carbon and they have the ear of government, it's going to be, a lot more politically stable over time. And so certainly with things like GM and the major auto manufacturers really making a commitment to go all in on EVs, that's almost like a kind of a divorce letter, frankly, to the oil and gas industry on the political lobbying front, right? They're saying, look, we were in this together and now we've found a new sweetheart and we're running off with the electricity sector and that's who we're going to work with. And so the more that you have industries that have really reoriented themselves around a world with this carbon price, the bigger and more powerful that the renewable energy industry gets as opposed to other components of electricity generation, the more politically stable this gets over time.
Okay. David?
I guess just to say, it's hard to judge. We've all been doing this a long time. I've been 30 years in climate. There's no question right now feels amazing. There's a sense of real action on climate, a sense of, obviously, with Biden administration and lots of talk and youth activism, but this is going to be tough. And we are going to see, if you actually are serious about doing what I think you should do, which is drive towards zero by sort of 2060, the economic hit, I think, is going to be significant. And you are going to see tax revolts. And I think you'll see it. It's easy to support when the economic hit hasn't really started. But I agree with Sarah about EVs are going to happen, but EVs are really not a big contributor. Light-duty vehicles are a surprisingly small contributor to global emissions. And I think when you start to get to the hard stuff, including the hard parts of reshaping electricity and heavy industry, it's going to get hard. And I think that's when the real battle starts, and it's so hard to guess. That's when voters will really get tested in how serious they are about how high a priority this is compared to other big priorities like healthcare.
Yeah,
because we can't have it all.
Yeah. We've got major parties. Most of the major federal parties campaigned on carbon pricing, strong climate plans in the last election, with one notable exception. The only party who, would have a realistic chance of forming government were there an election in the spring.
Although the most important thing to say that is really interesting is the Conservative Party has been remarkably quiet, and the new leader on this carbon pricing. And so my sense is they are watching 905 polling and they know the world is changing.
Yeah, and I'd say as was industry generally.
Yeah.
Who came out against the carbon price? The government of Alberta saying this is, Ottawa knows best. But industry, its response, I thought, was remarkably muted. Mark, you're, of course, an industry observer and an advisor. So what do you think about this political stability question?
Well, I don't, on the one hand, we might be saying, and maybe our poll does that, let's predict what's going to happen, where's the price going to be and so on by 2030. To me, that's a bet on politics. That when we think about what's achievable, even David's point from a cost perspective, as I did in my book, I split it into two things. I say it's a global collective problem. So your industries that are trading and competing globally, actually, they're not going to do anything. The pricing system we have for industry is just playing at the edge. So that's half of our emissions. And I don't see those going down significantly in the next 10 years. So that's the part of these results that I'm more dubious of the model runs I showed you, because we need to have carbon tariffs and some kind of tariff. It's called border carbon adjustments or something that helps our industry out, because we're not going to see the Biden administration doing big things. If they go down a tariff path, that would be fantastic. But I put a low probability on that. I also put a low probability of the Biden administration being able to get a carbon price at all, an explicit carbon price. So what are we talking about? We're talking about things you do domestically. And there, I think our strategic path, and I'm more optimistic, and maybe Sarah was saying the same thing. I do think we can flip the transportation sector quickly. And I think that's important. And I think you can look at Norway right now. It's crazy what's happening. And now we are getting auto manufacturers to play into that. China is doing something very similar. Likewise in electricity generation. Just think of Ontario in 10 years phasing out 1/4 of its electricity generation, which was coal, and doing it in two political terms of a government. That's important. It has to be something that flips quickly. Because you're not going to keep the same governments in power. And then of course, that is why I'm worried about explicit carbon pricing, because David, maybe you say the Conservatives have been silent about this, but actually I've heard Erin O'Toole say, nope, we're still dead against the carbon price and we'll do it other ways, which then I try to corner people like that and say, you mean the low carbon fuel standard, the coal plant phase out electricity, the methane regulations, and so on. Because then they tend to get vague. So I guess I'm saying I'm, as always, betting low and hoping high. And so I'm always trying to think about the strategic path. And so if I see environmentalists who are saying, we got to make sure industry reduces by the same amount, that steel industry and so on, I'm like, that has a political difficulty an order of magnitude higher than us working in electricity, transportation, buildings. And look at the Scandinavians, we can flip all this stuff quite quickly.
Yeah, but the irony is when Conservatives come out and say, well, we don't want to affect consumers. We don't want them to pay it at the pump or on their heating fuel, but they keep intact industrial carbon pricing systems, as Jason Kenney has here. So where are the emissions? If you're a Conservative politician, you've got this strong base in Alberta, who's going to get hammered? Alberta's industry. If you want to hit a 2030 target and you're giving the consumer a free pass on it, that's the irony.
Yeah, but I mean, the Conservatives, that's why I'm saying something like an output-based pricing system gives a correct marginal price. We say for little things you do to reduce emissions. But if you want to invest in a new oil sands plant, the average cost of your emissions is very small. And so these are things that aren't going to reduce our output of oil sands or steel or aluminum or cement. They're policies that don't affect the cost of production by more than 5%, whereas the cost of energy services for people as we flip out of electricity towards electric vehicles and so on are a little more than 5%. So that would be my argument.
And I think that comes back to the politics question. If you ask around, what is going to happen in that space? And of course, there's a lot of other things other than just carbon policy, hard for me to remember sometimes. But if we listen on the carbon policy piece, and, if you believe the polling that Canadians want to see action on climate, I think what we don't know completely is how good is the electorate at judging plans that are put forward by politicians that claim to be action on climate. So, could there be a world in which you have a party that says, yes, we're going to act on climate, and here's our plan plan, and we can look at it and say, look, this is not really going to achieve those emissions reductions, which is sort of, I think, what you were just saying, Mark and Ed, but that voters sort of buy it as a credible plan. And so that's where I think the politics comes into that question of where those votes go.
Yeah,
it'd be a world. I think I live in that world.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, let's tackle the last question very quickly. Then let's turn to Q&A. We want to talk about the economic hits. Mark, you showed a slide that said, well, there's a 0.2% economic hit from 2.1% GDP growth to 1.9%. I remember going back to that report I mentioned came out in 2008 when we said, well, for Canada to achieve a science-based climate target, back then, when you layer in a triple-digit price, the growth of the oil sands goes from this down to this. And people didn't focus on, great, we still have strong growth. What they focused in on was the delta between business as usual and bending it down. People do not like anything that costs economic growth. And that ties back to a question around political stability and the 905 gamble. So what is the economic hit? David, let's go to you.
I don't know, but I think the economic hit of really driving seriously towards zero will be pretty big. I think we really haven't driven an energy transition like that before, and I think it's likely that the disruptions are significant, of order percent GDP. To be clear, I think they should happen, but I think that's the scale we're talking about. But I want to circle to a separate thing. Part of the pitch that the government is making is that they're going to put a huge amount of money into innovation, and that green jobs and new green industries and green exports will help to compensate. And I don't think that's crazy, but what I am really worried about is the Canadian tendency to spread the money really thinly to everything, meaning that you just piss it away and achieve nothing. So if you look at that plan, it's filled with a bunch of things, each of which, or many of which, might be good ideas, innovation in a whole bunch of different clean tech technologies. But the reality is, Canada is a small country. The world competition is hard. And I think if you're China or the US, you can kind of afford to say you don't have anything like industrial policy, it's just total free competition. But I don't think that's that plausible for a country of Canada's size. And I think Canada does need to find some effective ways to do something that's a lot like picking winners, but obviously you've got to do it in a way that minimizes the lock-in and doesn't keep feeding things just because you threw bad money there before.
Okay, Mark, why don't you jump in? And then, sir, I want to use this because you had mentioned border carbon adjustments, or essentially carbon protection. I want to get that point in because that line in the climate plan, I don't think got enough attention, but there is huge momentum around, say, industries like steel for North America to put up a carbon fence around our industries as we drive down their carbon intensity.
Well, or we're doing it in conjunction with the Europeans, but let me get to that in 1 second.
Sure.
I just wanted to sort of one other way to look at this. So David is saying it will cost a lot, and I agree with him. And in the book, Sustainable Fossil Fuels, I pointed out how fantastic fossil fuels are, and that's why. So we have to innovate all these alternatives. But we're actually been making some good progress on that lately, as Sarah's been mentioning. In that book, Sustainable Fossil Fuels, I took a bunch of data from, it was a lot of research, and here's just something I'm throwing out, just for fun numbers for people. For our great-great-great-grandparents, whatever, in around 1900, if there was such thing as this typical middle family in Canada, energy services were about 20% of their family budget. And in 2000, 100 years later, energy services, the way, still trying to measure them the same way as energy historians, economic historians do, were about 6%. And then those of us who modeled a transition over 50 years, most of the modeling settles in that would go from 6% to about 8% or 9% of a budget. So you get it? It's still way lower than it was for our great-grandparents, but it would be more expensive as these alternatives to the high-quality energy fossil fuels. So that's the challenge. As I try to put it like that, though, to say, look, we're still so much better off, and we're making the planet not dismantle itself. Now, your just question about then how do we get this global action, which is the thing that really torments me these days, because you need individual countries that are climate leaders to already recognize that these annual meetings in which we look for a voluntary global agreement and everyone's going to be happy about it, they will never come to fruition. That people have different interests, different countries, that some are fossil fuel endowed and not, some are much poorer, and so on and so forth. And so, unfortunately, we're going to need leader countries to put in carbon tariffs so that laggard countries finally have an incentive to act, even though they didn't want to. Of course, there should be transfers from rich countries to poor countries, but there will never be enough of that. And so the way you would do that with border carbon adjustments, and I don't even like that term so much, let's just call it carbon tariffs. The Europeans now want to start putting in carbon tariffs because they know their costs are going up if they're climate leaders. Canada needs to join up with them. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Biden administration, so I'm not predicting, but I'm saying there's a decent chance that they will start thinking about carbon tariffs as part of a American workers while we save the planet protection scheme. So that's something that I'm hoping for.
And Mark, I mean, how is that not developed countries just punishing developing countries?
Yeah, and so as I work through in the book, this is right now, we're really punishing them by not putting on tariffs, because what we're doing is we're staying on a path that will cause more harm in the developing world than in the developed world. They will be less able to withstand all of the ravages of climate change as we will. Their healthcare systems are not as well built up, their infrastructure. And so we right now are on a path of enormous cost to the developing world. And so we have to think about what's the strategic path where we have at least a chance, because most likely we're just going to keep failing and they are going to bear a huge cost. That's the path that we're already on. I'm trying to get off that path.
Okay, over to Sarah.
I would go back to the cost question that David had. And I mean, I guess we'll have to meet in 10 years on the podcast and or whatever new format we have by then and see who's right. But I'm more optimistic, or I guess question more this idea of a big economic hit. I think one thing, when we talk about these models, and I say this not to criticize modelers as someone who's done modeling myself, our models are really good at sort of modeling, sort of small changes or adjustments along a path. What's a lot harder to do is to model these more abrupt transitions. And so particularly in a world where there's a lot of other things going on in the markets that Canada is selling to, I think we have to be careful about, looking at results that come out and say, GDP is higher or lower by 0.5% and sort of assigning too much weight to that. The other piece, I think, also is, and Mark mentioned and talked about this in terms of like what is actually, the cost of energy compared to the cost of all our other services. And I would broaden that even further, and maybe you saw my son coming in to interrupt me and prove my point around some work that I've been doing recently on the idea of, what is the climate impact and what is the GDP impact when we think about all kinds of other elements in our society, like undercompensated or uncompensated caregiving work, for example. And so, it's just like a fantastically complicated question to ask. What does the low carbon and ultimately zero carbon, but even the 2030 picture look like? I think it's really important that we be talking about it from a well-being perspective, because that's frankly what matters at the end of the day. And as Mark said, the GDP impact of climate change itself, we know, far outpaces what we're talking about in the cost of change. But I think even more fundamentally, it's sort of, if Canada isn't moving ahead while others are, then that cost becomes large.
Great. Okay, let's turn to audience questions now. We've got Dan Vinelovich. He's going to ask a question as someone who just sat in on Alberta's emissions reductions, Alberta's energy savings for business program. I'm curious to hear what people have to say in response to Dan. Go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Sorry, I just had to unmute there. So my question is actually about provincial measures and the fact that, I think you've all acknowledged the federal government has done a lot of heavy lifting with this plan. I share some of the skepticism about whether it can actually deliver the promised tons. And, at the same time, we're facing pressure to go to the next COP and raise our ambition for 2030 targets. And so I think, the path to any further ambition runs through provincial capitals, not through Ottawa. And with Ontario and Alberta in particular, having actually rolled things back under the Ford and Kenney governments, if we were to actually look at being able to achieve more, what are some of the key things that provinces could do, and in particular, Alberta and Ontario?
Okay, pregnant pause. Who wants to jump in?
Do one thing that's one thing that's really hard. I don't know how it works in Canada, but it's basically making siting decisions faster. So if you think about my beefs with that model, I don't think Mark and I really disagree. The model sort of shows a longer term equilibrium behavior, but it doesn't show how difficult it is to actually get things to happen. So for example, you really want to cut electricity sector emissions, you need more long distance transmission. There's a bunch of other examples like that. And these things are very hard to permit and cite. And there are legitimate trade-offs, local control, local people's land, other pollution and labor impacts. And I think if we're going to, in industrial societies, actually cut emissions towards zero in sort of 20, 30 years, you need to find ways to make decisions faster. And that means some people are going to lose, but it has to be done in a democratic way where there's closure.
So to pick one, there's a long list. I guess one thing I would focus on in Alberta is really the electricity sector, right? And I think that there is an opportunity that's a little bit slipping from the hands of the government and the sector as a whole to avoid building out a lot of new natural gas infrastructure as we come off coal, right? And we're talking about getting to 2030. So that's one very specific thing that is then related to what David was saying. And what the way that you do that is by building out some of that infrastructure to trade power in larger amounts with BC, as well as looking at kind of the incentives to overcome some of the inertia, frankly, in the system around what gets built and what investors believe is a good decision. But in general, I think more of those complementary policies that are getting at places where the carbon pricing maybe has a hard time. So I mean, things like building standards as well, too, I think are quite important. Where David is making a big effort, I think, on his house to build it as low carbon as possible, and probably has a lot of stories about how that's challenging, even with the knowledge he has. So what are the things that we can do that help to move the building sector along in the practices that they have more quickly than would happen price alone?
Yeah, and on when we talk about geothermal, and yes, loyal listeners, we will do a show on geothermal. David can share his numbers on cost per ton abated for putting geothermal in at his house, and I'll share mine with solar. But sorry, Sarah, to your point, before we go to Mark, so say if we were to treat Manitoba as a battery for Saskatchewan to help Saskatchewan decarbonize its grid through strategic interties, that still out of necessity requires a role for the feds. I just don't see the provinces doing that themselves. You've got these fiefdoms, you got these provincial-owned utilities. It's the actions of the provinces, but the feds with a strong, parental hand from Ottawa need to make it happen.
Yeah, I think they need to support it, and you can replace, in your example, Alberta and BC, and it's not just the feds have a hand, but actually, industry is sort of sometimes saying things that aren't totally true in there, right? So everybody now in Alberta believes that if we were to build an intertie with BC, it would benefit BC and just come at as a cost to us, when in fact, being able to build out our wind and use the low cost electricity, battery storage in BC would benefit everybody in Alberta other than those who own peaking gas plants. But that's not how you would believe it if you were reading the news. So
yeah. And
over to Mark, who I think wants to jump in too.
Let's get Mark in. Let's get Mark in. Yeah.
Well, we're all good talkers, and it's fun. But I just want to sort of join Ed in, I think, pushing back a little bit on Dan's question. I personally thought that the Pan-Canadian framework, when Trudeau developed it, it was a delusion. It was this idea that, everyone will think like the same. And I'm a follower of Isaiah Berlin. People think differently. And so politics is about recognizing they'll think differently. The Pan-Canadian framework was like, we will achieve consensus. And I, for one, was like, the next election, it's gone. Somebody else will change. And it happened that way. And it's not like I have great powers of prediction. The reality is we need a reality in Canada where the federal government has recognized by the courts the power to enter into international agreements for global environmental issues and to enact environmental policy that does that. And I'm hoping we'll get that decision fairly soon. Provinces have jurisdiction over energy. That doesn't matter. This isn't about regulating the energy. It's about regulating pollution. And it turns out that there's only just a few things we need, and they should all be done by the federal government. And then if one province wants to lead, like British Columbia or Quebec, or maybe one day Alberta again, that's fine. But right now, all we need is the output-based pricing system. And that's for industry across the country, and that it's the benchmark carbon price. So basically that's running, if you don't do it. So basically we have a federal carbon price. In some cases, though, we'll want regulations. The coal phase out was started by Rachel Notley in Ontario. Now it's national. And then the low carbon fuel standard, hopefully with a ZEV mandate that starts with light duty vehicles, but needs to move, like the Californians are, to larger areas of transportation. And then building codes might still stay provincial, but that's okay because the federal government can do what we're doing in BC, which is a gas version of the low carbon fuel standard, where we're saying that the natural gas from underground, fossil fuel natural gas, carbon content and gas delivered through those systems has to decline over time. So it is like segmenting the clean fuel standard into its gaseous and liquid forms. And that's it. And the federal government should be doing all of that. And, so for me, if we get some provincial premier that wants to run an election against carbon pricing, let them do it all they want. And do policies that move quickly. So I'm happy that we're settling on the federal government right now. I could care less what some of the provinces want to do unless they can be leaders and help.
Yeah, and Mark, I couldn't help but notice that methane was absent in your list. You don't think it's important?
So yes, it is, exactly. And what I was talking about here was so that anything in the main trunk line of natural gas companies is going to go to industry or to buildings or wherever.
Okay. We've got another question from Karen Spencer. Thank you for your patience. Karen, go ahead.
Okay, just trying to unmute myself here.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Very, very good discussion. Thanks very much. One of my questions was just regarding carbon tax on natural gas. I think we have over 13 or 14 million households across Canada, and a really, really large proportion of them, I think like 90%, are heated and in fact by natural gas. So when you impose a carbon tax, we would love to see it push us towards, the better alternatives. But right now, what is that better alternative? And I just see this example anyways as being a really foundational one that we need an alternative built out first in some way. Otherwise, consumers are just paying tax and they don't have a viable alternative to shift to easily.
Fair enough. We talk a good talk about electrifying heat, but we see preciously few examples of it in anywhere in Canada that doesn't have cheap, abundant hydro. What do you think, Mark?
Well, I just want to say, Karen, you might be thinking about just single family homes, and even that is not 90%. And I have the data for certain provinces, and I'm going to guess at the data federally. It's more like 60%, maybe 65% of households are having natural gas heat. It's a lot lower than you might think. And so then you might say, wow, so 40% don't? Like, what are they using? So mostly it's electricity. A lot of it's in apartments and condos in resistance heating. But Sweden now, they were using oil for heating, and the Danes so Sweden for sure, its building stock is now zero emission. So they're using combinations of district heat that might use biomass. In homes, they're using wood and a lot of electricity, especially zero emission electricity. And of course, Norway was even using resistance electricity for a long time. Sweden's using more heat pumps. So what my point is that I can also show you what is their energy service cost for doing that. And yes, natural gas, even in a crappy furnace, is the cheapest way to heat a single family dwelling right now, because the natural gas is so cheap and it's probably going to stay cheap. So you're quite right. But the total cost to people of switching away towards electricity in most areas is not as much as you might think. And that's the transition we need to be making. We need to get up from 40% electricity to 70%. And it looks like it's not that hard.
And the timing element on that is a good question. And so, I think in the meantime, there's also still quite a bit that we can be doing around efficiency that, it makes it a lot easier to make the case for efficiency if your pricing on natural gas effectively goes up from the carbon price. but the design of the carbon pricing system also helps with a little bit of the problem of kind of the chicken and egg. Do you wait to impose a price or a regulation until you have the technology? But if you're waiting, then why is the technology ever going to come around? And the thing with carbon pricing is that money that's collected doesn't, just go away, right? So it can and is being rebated back to consumers. And so what that does is that it allows you to kind of lead with that, the regulatory or the policy signal that says, yes, this is where we need to go. And so now we need to work on, developing more, in some cases, getting used to installing heat pumps for colder climates and all of these things without, sort of running into that problem level. You want to go, but you can't go until you're there.
This is another example where I think we need government rules other than just a price, because for domestic heating, there's a huge evidence, especially with heat pumps, that it's much more efficient to do it in districts or in large complexes. Individual homes, heat pumps that are not air source just tend to be high capital costs. I think they'll stay that way. But the market won't, I think, naturally make developments be have district heating. I think that's where some government help is needed. Government rule setting, government standard setting, that's crucial to actually allowing this to happen in a reasonable time.
Yeah, and that, I mean, when we talk about industry, so take the steel industry, for example. You've got a bunch of blast furnaces that are nearing the end of their lives in Ontario. And if you want to decarbonize steel, you can pursue two paths. The traditional path with existing heating infrastructure is you add in hydrogen. But to do that, that's significantly expensive, and you need to find the hydrogen. It gets back to a previous conversation that we had, and the feds have completely under-resourced their hydrogen strategy, under-resourced by 4 to 6 times. Or you can help them shift to direct reduced iron or electric arc furnaces. And to do that, you're looking at an additional cost and spending basically the bulk of what they've set aside in the Strategic Innovation Fund in that updated climate program. You could blow it all on a couple blast furnaces. You'd get the emission savings, but you're not going to have money for other parts of industry. Okay, let's leave it at that. Stanley Lee, you have a question for us around outsourcing manufacturing.
Well, I guess I'm on the air now, so I just want to rephrase 2 of my questions into one, because I think that would make more sense. I think Professor Jackard mentioned something, or Professor Keith mentioned something about carbon tariffs in order for this problem to be addressed in a meaningful manner, given that manufacturing in general has been outsourced to developing nations because of costs or hidden costs for the past few decades. So my question is, let's say we're forming a carbon tariff regime across the world. How do you think the measurement and enforcement regime would work for that to be effective? Are there any lessons that we could take from the acid rain agreements that we've made decades ago and apply it to this problem? Thanks.
Mark, you want to jump in?
Yeah, but I'll just be brief. I mean, it will be similar to other cases where countries have used tariffs. So there's lots of cases of that. And things like outsourcing, though, yes, that's what we're trying to prevent. Of course, much of the outsourcing that we witnessed over the last decades, of course, has nothing to do with climate policy, because that wasn't what rose the costs and made outsourcing profitable for companies. So companies will still be outsourcing. The question is, how do you get a global effort so that nobody can, it's a standard problem we call it game theory, and it's like how you play any kind of game. And so that's what we're trying to do. But there's all sorts of models there of setting tariffs. And Bill Nordhaus has one version of this. Others have another. Bill Nordhaus, the economist who won the Nobel Prize not long ago for climate modeling. And they involve that you look at other countries and say, you look at sectors. You might say, how do you make your steel? And nowadays, part of our international agreements are to collect data so that countries have to report. And it's actually not that hard to figure out what are their emissions per ton of steel? What about in their electricity sector? What about in their cement? And so it'll be in some key sectors where you would apply this initially.
Okay. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think that's I'll use it as a chance to kind of pull in the business side of things as well too, because I think, again, these all work hand in hand. So we're going to have, increasing ratcheting up policies from governments, but I think that the next decade is also going to bring the actions on the business side, to the forefront. We've seen that with renewable energy, where, there were a number of companies early, and now it's really almost standard practice across many industries for companies to be sourcing renewable energy. And I think you're going to see the same kind of things, brought into the carbon footprint of products that are sold by many manufacturers. And that fundamentally, again, I think government's policy, directs business, but at the end of the day, we only move our entire economy. You can kind of leave some companies behind, but you can't leave them all behind. And so that kind of, being able to respond to demand from consumers who are saying, I care about the carbon content of my product, is just going to be another element of that change that we are seeing. And the fact that, GM ran this, or is running this silly commercial during the Super Bowl, that if you haven't seen, you should check it out. It's hilarious. I think it just shows that, where companies think consumers want them to go. And that is really going to drive a lot of change as we move forward.
Great. David, last answer to you, and go Bucks.
Just again to say, industrial change is hard. Ed, you were talking about you just need hydrogen to steel plants, but nobody's built commercial scale hydrogen-driven steelmaking, and there'd be a lot of development time to get that to be real. I think that's where this industrial turnover is just going to be harder than people think. There's no question we can do it, but it's not going to be easy.
Great. All right. Thank you. Let's have a quick look at our poll. We're not that optimistic that we're going to hit our Paris target. Looks like most of us, close to half, think we're going to get close. A third of us think not super close. And then 5 or 20%, 1/5 of you out there are a little more optimistic that we're going to come within spitting distance of hitting that target. All right. So this episode, first off, actually, before I go on, I really want to thank Mark. Mark, fantastic. Registrations and attendance for this webinar were off the charts compared to previous shows that we've done. And maybe there's some pent up demand, but we think that you and your thinking has been a big draw. So thank you so much.
I love this. Thank you very much for inviting me. Can I get in again sometime? I would love to come back.
Well,
absolutely.
Talk to our agents. We'll see. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
My agent will talk to your agent.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back. And keep, thanks for producing those great primers. For those who haven't seen it, check out Mark's 6-minute primer on the clean fuel standard. If today's discussion wasn't enough, tune in. You'll walk away with a black belt in CFS and LCFS. We'll be back on the air on Tuesday, February 16th. Mark your calendars with CBC Radio's Laura Lynch as a guest. She is the host of the popular CBC show, What on Earth? And we're going to take a different tack. We're going to talk about the communications or media side of the climate and energy debate. We have, after that, a really fun season 2 planned. We've got a couple in-conference shows that we're doing in March at the Solar Alberta Conference and then at the Calgary Climate Symposium. We have topics on decarbonizing and electrifying transportation, unpacking net zero, and yes, geothermal we will cover at some point this season. Give us feedback, energyversusclimate@gmail.com on the show, on topics. We're very happy to get it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.